What's good, everybody? Today I want to talk about Dutch capitalism, the mother of all capitalisms. The Dutch pretty much invented the type of capitalism we know today. In short, capitalism is where a nation uses its entrepreneurs as a sort of a golden geese, and that lay golden eggs. And the eggs are mainly taxes and exclusive mutual beneficial agreements between the governments and the businessmen of the nation. I'm going to show you a video by Ray Dalio. You may have seen it already, where he talks about the rise and fall of nations, and he talks particularly about the Dutch in the golden era, the British, and the rise of and the fall of the British and the United States. He also mentions China. But before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Dutch capitalism. During the early days of Dutch capitalism, the Netherlands was known as the Dutch Republic. In Dutch, that was Republiek der Zeven Verenigde Nederlanden, meaning it translates to the seven united republics of the Netherlands, or Low Countries. Netherlands meaning Low Countries. So, translated now we just say the Netherlands, but it really means the Low Countries. In France, they say les Pays Bas, meaning Low Countries. So the golden goose for the Dutch Republic was the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. I will refer to it as the VOC. VOC is the Vereniging Oost-Indische Compagnie. I'm just going to say VOC, because otherwise I'm going to have to say DEIC. So the specific type of capitalism that was practiced during the golden age of the Dutch was mercantile capitalism. It's where the VOC had governmental power, but it was limited. And in a few instances, they could wage war against another country. So they could act as a representative of the country. These were their benefits. And in return, they would pay income tax. So now they were the only ones paying that amount of income tax during the times. The citizens were just, citizens. They had another type of tax. But this tax was the main source of income for the nation, the state. So their golden egg, however, was their trading capacities and the ability to turn the guilder into a world reserve. So let's watch this video by Ray Dalio, where he talks about the rise and fall, and also he mentions the guilder as a golden reserve and how that is important in capitalism.
The most important events that surprised me did so because they never happened in my lifetime. These painful surprises led me to study the last 500 years of history for similar situations, where I saw that they had indeed happened many times before, with the ups and the downs of the Dutch, British, and U.S. empires. I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. Fight it. During this phase, leaders within the country have to design an excellent system to raise the country's wealth and power. First and foremost, to be great, they must have strong education, which is not just teaching knowledge and skills, but also strong character, civility, and work ethic. These are typically taught in the family, schools, and religious institutions. That provides a healthy respect for rules and laws, order within society, low corruption, and enables them to unite behind a common purpose and work well together. As they do this, they increasingly shift from producing basic products to innovating and inventing new technologies. For example, the Dutch rose to defeat the Habsburg Empire and become superbly educated. They became so inventive that they came up with a quarter of all major inventions in the world, the most important of which was the invention of ships that could travel around the world to collect great riches, and the invention of capitalism, as we know it today, to finance those voyages. They, like all leading empires, enhanced their thinking by being open to the best thinking in the world. As a result, the people in the country become more productive and more competitive in world markets, which shows up in their growing economic output and rising share of world trade. You can see this happening now as the US and China are roughly comparable in both their economic outputs and their shares of world trade. As countries trade more globally, they must protect their trade routes and their foreign interests from attack, so they develop great military strength. If done well, this virtuous cycle leads to strong income growth, which can be used to finance investments in education, infrastructure, and research and development. They must also develop systems to incentivize and empower those that have the ability to make or take wealth. In all of these cases, the most successful empires used a capitalist approach to develop productive entrepreneurs. Even China, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party, used a form of this capitalist approach. Deng Xiaoping, when asked about this, said, "It doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as it catches mice. And it's glorious to be rich." To do this well, they must develop their capital markets. Most importantly, their lending, bond, and stock markets. That allows people to convert their savings into investments to fund invention and development, and share in the successes of those who make great things happen. The Dutch created the first publicly listed company, the Dutch East India Company, and the first stock market to fund it, which were integral parts of the system that produced massive wealth and power. As a natural consequence, the greatest empires developed the world's leading financial centers for attracting and distributing the world's capital. Amsterdam was the world's financial center when the Dutch were preeminent. London, when the British were on top. New York is now, and China is quickly developing its financial centers. Most importantly, the capitalists, the governments, and the military must work together. Not only did the Dutch work well together, they were one and the same. The Dutch East India Company was granted a trade monopoly from the government and had its own officially sanctioned military to go out into the global markets to make and take wealth. The British followed with the British East India Company and had a similar coordination of their government, business, and military operations. The U.S. military-industrial complex followed suit, as does the Chinese system today. As the country becomes the largest international trading empire, its transactions can be paid with its currency, making it the preferred global medium of exchange. And because their currency is so widely accepted and frequently used, people around the world want to save in it, making it the preferred storehold of wealth, and thus the world's leading reserve currency. The guilder was the world's main reserve currency when the Dutch led world trade, the pound was when the British led, and the dollar has been since the US led. Naturally, China's currency is increasingly being used as a reserve currency.
Here's where I might disagree with Mr. Dalio. He assumes that China is going to be the next world power, and the reserve world currency will be the yen. If you've been following the sources I have, you would know that the next reserve currency will be in the form of digital currency through blockchain, and not the current gold fiat system. CBDC stands for Central Banking Digital Currency. It might still mean that China will be the next world power because the charts do tell that story, but I don't think it's going to be the one, because we still don't know who owns Bitcoin. Also, for a state to host the world reserve currency, it must also be able to gain the trust and the respect of the world community. And as of now, in my opinion, China is nowhere near trust or respect in the world community. But hey, there's always war, which trumps, that option. Pun intended. China following the United States, which Britain came before, and then the Dutch became before that. That will be a whole cultural shift that the world has yet to see. Let's get back to capitalism. I mentioned earlier that the type of capitalism that the Dutch Republic at its peak used was mercantile capitalism, where the ruling authority got its income from a few golden geese, and in exchange they were granted special privileges within the state. In the case of the VOC, they could practice trade monopolies and claim land in the name of the Republic, and among many other things, like the whole colonial slavery thing. The Netherlands we know now is no longer operating under mercantile capitalism, obviously. As a matter of fact, we haven't fully experienced mercantile capitalism since the fall of the British East India Company. I'd say the closest we get is what we have now as the Rockefellers and the JP Morgans. We'll talk about that later. What I can tell you is that mercantile capitalism works almost parallel or exactly the same way as technocracy would, only with better gadgets. Technocracy is, it's something that, it's a modern term. We haven't fully seen it yet. Everybody says, no, that's not possible. But as they explain in the video, most of these things happens once in every few generations. So nobody has seen it happening in their life. Let's watch the video to understand how this worked.
While in the top phase, most of these strengths are sustained, embedded within the fruits of their success are the seeds of their decline. As a rule, as people in these rich and powerful countries earn more, that makes them more expensive and less competitive relative to people in other countries who are willing to work for less. At the same time, people in other countries naturally copy the methods and technologies of the leading power, which further reduces the leading power's competitiveness. For example, British shipbuilders had less expensive workers than Dutch shipbuilders. So they hired Dutch designers to design better ships that were built by less expensive British workers, making them more competitive, which led the British to rise and the Dutch to decline. Also, as people become richer, they tend not to work as hard. They enjoy more leisure, pursue the finer and less productive things in life, and at the extreme become decadent. Values change from generation to generation during the rise to the top, from those who had to fight to achieve wealth and power to those who inherited it. They're less battle-hardened, steeped in luxuries, and accustomed to the easy life, which makes them more vulnerable to challenges. The golden era of the Dutch Empire and the Victorian era of the British Empire were such high prosperity periods like this. The financial bubble bursts. This creates great domestic hardships and forces the country to choose between defaulting on its debts or printing a lot of new money. It always chooses to print a lot of new money. At first gradually, and eventually massively. That devalues the currency and raises inflation. For the Dutch, this was the financial crisis brought about by financial excesses and paying for the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Similarly, for the British, it was paying for its financial excesses and its debts from the two world wars. And for the U.S., it's been 3 cycles of debt finance booms and busts since the 90s, with the central bank stepping in each time with stronger measures. When the flight of wealth gets bad enough, governments outlaw it. Those seeking to get out begin to panic. These turbulent conditions undermine productivity, which shrinks the economic pie and causes more conflict about how to divide the shrinking resources. Populist leaders emerge from both sides and pledge to take control and bring about order. That's when democracy is most challenged because it fails to control the anarchy. And it is when the move to a strong populist leader who will bring order to the chaos is most likely. As conflict within the country escalates, it leads to some form of revolution or civil war to redistribute wealth and force the necessary big changes. This can be peaceful and maintain the existing order, but it's more often violent and changes the order have been devalued. For the Dutch, this happened after their defeat in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, when they weren't able to repay the massive debts they built up during it. This led to a run on the Bank of Amsterdam and a desperate sell-off, forcing massive money printing, which devalued the currency and the empire into irrelevance.
So where is the Netherlands now? Whoa. Everybody okay? Where is the Netherlands now? The Netherlands is now a welfare capitalist state, which is far from mercantile capitalism. This means that the state is no longer just a tax collector, it's also a provider and a regulator. It doesn't have special classes, or it's not supposed to have special classes. It's a step closer to socialism, and it also means that the golden goose or geese will be heavily regulated and restricted, like in a farm. And it probably won't be golden eggs, it'll just be regular eggs, but a lot of it. A state will usually fall in this phase of capitalism, usually after a period of crisis or inequality. For the Netherlands and most of Europe, this was at the end of World War II. Between 1945 and 1980 is when the foundations for pensions, healthcare, and welfare systems that were built that we're now seeing the fruits of here in the Netherlands. I guess the fruits are, but it's all also running its course. The financial crash of 2008 also recently perpetuated the situation, so that we are in a welfare state, that we're dependent on the government for an income, and it's not so, or the government is dependent on, it's a mutual thing, I guess. Now let me show you the 4 phases of capitalism in order. It is a cycle that eventually leads back to the mercantile system of capitalism. Like I mentioned before, now they call it technocracy, or what we are seeing coming as technocracy. Okay, phase 1, capitalism, often mercantile or laissez-faire they call it. It's private ownership, minimal state interference, rapid growth, innovation, and wealth concentration. Phase 2, crisis or inequality spikes, which is where the Netherlands is right now. In the long term, I'm not saying that the Netherlands is in a crisis, but it just got out of one about 60 to 70 years ago. The whole world did. So we're seeing now the effects of it. We're no longer in a crisis, but we already made the deal. So now we're living that part of it. Phase 3 is an increased state involvement. I would argue that the Netherlands might be in phase 3 instead of phase 2. It's an increased state involvement, regulations, social safety nets, redistribution or nationalization to stabilize society and reduce inequality. Phase 4 is pushback and liberalization. Over time, excessive state control can stifle innovation and efficiency, leading to calls for deregulation and privatization. And then it returns to phase 1, which is capitalism. I would say the US is at phase 4. Now these phases overlap, as you may have seen in the video. It doesn't happen in a straight timeline. Sometimes some things happens before the other, but if you look at the bigger picture, you will see that you are, between these 2 phases for sure. Maybe not exactly in a phase. In certain areas you are, in certain areas you aren't. It's just to get a better idea of, if you look at things from a more of an outside perspective, or from a wider perspective, of history. So for the U.S., phase 1 would be Carnegie, like I said earlier, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Ford, Coca-Cola, and other multinational corporations that conquered the global market in the name of the United States. As you can see, some of these companies, they were there before and after World War. Like Coca-Cola was just, a little baby, and because it could ride out the war, it became, some of them didn't, make it. Some, you could search up the history of these companies, and you'll see how they rode the wave. So this phase, we can't call it quite mercantile, but we can call it industrial type capitalism, because it wasn't fully mercantile as I described earlier. Phase 2 would be the Great Depression. Again, this was before the war, but that's what I mean with it overlaps a little bit with some things happen not quite at the same time. So the Depression came and the war came. So the war was had more of an effect on Europe than it had on the United States in a negative way. The Depression was the negative thing for the United States. They were already through that stage. So now phase 3 is when the US started focusing on pensions, and as we know now, that bubble has already pretty much birthed in the US. So they started a little bit earlier. Europe caught on afterwards. They followed suit of what the US was doing with the whole pension concept, which is pretty much new in modern times. So the US is now in phase 4, which is to become a technocratic state. Or China might come in and sweep their glory. Who knows? Who knows? We don't know with this new, there's a new player in the game, which is digital currency, and AI also. So these are going to be so whoever controls these things, I think is going to be the new world order, or the new world, at least reserve currency. Most people think it's going to be a state, a nation. It might not even be a state. It might be a corporation. And as we know, some countries are already operating as corporations. So we don't know which corporation might, we don't know which corporations might take over the world currency. So let's continue with the video.
As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
Modern capitalism started in the Dutch Republic in the early 17th century. They launched the first world currency, the guilder, and backed it with state-run megacorporations like the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, powered by cutting-edge sailing tech. After losing to the British in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, the pound took over. Then came the dollar, our current world reserve. 3 empires, 3 currencies, 3 cycles. What we call technocracy today is just mercantile capitalism in a lab coat. Same game, new mask. The cycle is not over. It's just changing uniforms. Some historians can speculate that the Chinese yuan will be the next world currency. But if you have been following the sources I have, you would know that the next world reserve currency will be the digital currency through blockchain, CBDC, central banking digital currency. Whoever is the authority or the regulator of the digital currency will be the next world reserve currency nation. Whether it will be a traditional shift of a country like USA, China, Russia, or maybe even a surprise entry of whatever happens in the Middle East, or a corporation like Palantir, BlackRock, the WEF, or a surprise entry like TikTok or sentient AI. If you know who it is, put it in the comments below. History says that it's not the first time we have been at the end of a capitalistic cycle, and it might just be part of a modern society. Click the link below to see my full video about this topic. You will see me next time.